Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 41, A Frank Discussion. Ruby had never really been too sure what her favorite place on Remnant was. There were definitely a few contenders though. Home was always a good one, the warm wooden structure set in the middle of the woods providing comfort and good memories. Beacon was another, filled with students with weapons, and teachers who were dedicated to helping them all achieve their goals. Workshops and forges were great too, the heat that filled the air always helping her feel invigorated. However, she could never pick one of them to be the best. It always changed to whichever one she was visiting. Even as she sat in the ice cream parlor, happily chewing away at a strawberry ice cream covered cookie with Yang and Coco sitting across from her, she couldn't help but feel all other places paled in comparison to the sweet aroma of the store. The store was really nice though. It wasn't the one she usually went to, though she generally stopped by whatever dessert place she found eventually, but she did quite like it. The walls were a mix of pink, white, and brown, a classic Neapolitan scheme, but it was a classic for a reason. Even the serving girl wore a pink, white, and brown outfit, but was also either wearing a wig or had dyed her hair to match. It was a nice effect, and Ruby had to admire her dedication. The palace also seemed to do a wide selection of cakes and cookies too, all which could be paired with ice cream. Of course, she had taken full advantage of having her own money, and ordered 5 hot cookies with a large scoop of strawberry ice cream. Yang hadn't exactly been happy, but Ruby felt she deserved it after having done so well on her tests recently. Besides, it wasn't like Yang wasn't guilty of the same thing. She too had ordered a large bowl of strawberry ice cream, along with a bowl of chocolate caramel for Coco, and a small cake covered in strawberry icing with a dollop of regular cream on top. Ruby still always found it funny how everyone assumed her favorite food was cookies, but despite them being amazingly tasty and giving her energy, she agreed with Yang on the fact that strawberries were the most delicious thing in the world. Except strawberry cookies, but that was hardly a fair competition. Unfortunately, the store didn't have any of those. "Sorry if I'm intruding on sister time," Coco said as she dipped her spoon into the dark brown ice cream. "Wouldn't have invited you if you were a babe," Yang replied with an effortless smile. "Ruby doesn't mind either. Right, Rubes?" "Nope," she confirmed honestly. "I know you haven't seen each other much lately. I'm definitely not looking forward to being a second year." "Yeah, you've had more in the last month than we've had since we started Beacon." "It's mostly Dr. Oobleck and Professor Port," the brunette groaned. "A 6-page essay on the Battle of Rainside." "Rainside?" Ruby asked in confusion. "I've never heard of it." "It was a city on the southwest of Anima. There was a battle there during the Great War, and the entire thing sunk into the ocean." "Like Mountain Glen?" "Sort of," Coco hummed with a nod. "But that was just an offshoot of Vale. Rainside was on its way to becoming a fully fledged kingdom of its own." That news was a little depressing. Ruby was well aware that it wasn't unusual for villages to disappear overnight without a trace, but those were usually small pop-up settlements that either moved on or succumbed to Grimm. The fact a whole city that had bordered on being a kingdom had been destroyed because of a stupid war didn't sit well with her. Had they evacuated? And if not, how many lives had that one battle alone cost them? She didn't think she was ready for that answer yet, so let the conversation move on. "Still, nothing compared to what Professor Goodwich gave us. A full breakdown of combat history since the creation of the Huntsman Academies. But that isn't really too bad, just long." "Of course you would say that about Glinda's assignment." Yang snorted in amusement, taking a bite of her cake. "Hoping she'll mark your assignment with a heart?" It was rare, so rare in fact that Ruby didn't think she'd ever seen it, but what looked like a small blush appeared on Coco's face. The woman never made any effort to hide just how much she looked up to the stern vice principal, even going so far as to help the older woman out from time to time, but clearly there was something more than just respect there. And while Ruby couldn't really imagine having a crush on a teacher, she couldn't deny that Goodwich was definitely an attractive lady. "No idea what you're talking about." Coco coughed and made herself busy with her ice cream. "MHM, totally gonna pretend I didn't catch you staring at her legs multiple times." Yang laughed as Coco shook her head, digging into her own ice cream. "So, Rubles," she pointed a spoon of melted strawberry in her direction. "How that thing you were working on for Weisco?" "All done." Ruby grinned, patting the belt on her pouch. "I hope she likes it though. I wanted her to have something for when she doesn't have Mitre Master with her." I'm sure she'll love it, even if she might not show it properly. I know. She smiled at her sister. What made you think of it anyway? Coco asked. When she was disarmed by Pyrrha in our last fight, she was just stuck trying to get her rapier back. I realized how much she relies on it for her semblance, and I kinda didn't want her to be held back by not having it. Smart thinking. Even though they were both leaders, Coco's acknowledgement still made Ruby feel proud. Though you still lost. Yeah. Ruby pouted and pushed her spoon through the gooey cookie. John's strategy was better than mine this time. Didn't help that there was something else holding your tea. Coco was cut off by a look from Yang, and Ruby felt her own face drop a little. She knew what Coco had been about to say. It wasn't the first time the subject had been brought up, as Yang had talked to her a couple of times. However, every time her sister had brought it up, she'd quickly made herself busy or came up with some excuse. I wanted to. She lied. She never wanted to accidentally hurt someone. But I was fighting John, and he's definitely better than he was, and all the training with Pyrrha is paying off, but he still isn't super confident, and I didn't want to accidentally hurt him. The words fell out of her mouth. Though she knew nobody else would have taken it easy, or ever did, those things were important to her. I get that, Rubes. Yang breathed gently. But it's not just John. You even hold back against Pyrrha, and she's better than both of us. The mere fact that Yang would admit that showed just how strongly she felt about the subject, and Ruby really didn't want to blow her off. Ruby let out a small sigh and stirred her ice cream. I use a scythe. I can spin it so fast, and it's so sharp it can cut through trees. All it would take is one mistake. I don't want to hurt someone. Like I said? Yang nodded and passed a piece of her cake to Coco. I get that. But you're an amazing fighter, and you know I don't believe for a second that you would ever lose control of Crescent Rose. But I do all the time. Ruby countered. When I was crushing on Blake, I was constantly screwing up moves, and even new moves take a while to get the muscle memory for. If that happens at the wrong time, if I'm not ready or I trip, the momentum can easily hurt someone. She paused for a second and let out a sigh. I wish I could just fight Grim. Just before she looked down at her ice cream, she saw Yang and Coco exchange a look. She knew they both thought people weren't always redeemable, that some people were just bad, but Ruby didn't believe that. She'd seen herself the people that everyone said were irredeemable. She'd overheard Cardin, who everyone wrote off as nothing more than a jerk, offer to help Sky out when his dad was having money issues, and had seen him fight Grim at the risk of his own life to protect Russell. She'd seen what she knew now were pirates coming ashore on Patch as a young girl, watching scared from the treeline, and help a small child who fell over while chasing a friend. Of course she knew those were bad people. She was never blind to how they hurt people too, but those little acts of compassion, surely they showed who those people could be if only given a chance. And how would they be encouraged to change if she simply knocked them out or went at them unrestrained like Yang or Blake would? They wouldn't. Fighting would only make them mistrustful, make them more likely to fight back. And when people fight back, they stop listening. There had to be a better way. You can take Grim missions when you graduate, Ruby, Coco said, her voice likely only so soft because Yang was giving her a watchful gaze. Hell, you can take only Grim missions next year when you are allowed to take unsupervised missions. But a mission doesn't always remain how it was when you chose it, and it's Beacon's job to prepare you for whatever you might face out there, which includes the fact you might fight people. I know. Ruby sighed, dipping at the now melting ice cream. I'll think about it, I promise. I just don't like it. I like to talk to people first. And you know I love that about you, sis. The blonde reached out and took her hand, giving her the same reassuring smile she had their whole life. I just don't want to see you to hold back on the wrong person and get hurt. Giving a small nod and continuing to eat her ice cream. It wasn't that she didn't understand that Yang and Coco just wanted to keep her safe, nor that she didn't understand why they were asking her to go all out. She just didn't think that was her. She'd done it a few times, mostly during team sparring, and every time it had felt weird. The feeling that she needed to be savage, that she needed to offer no chance and completely dominate her opponent, it felt wrong. That was how she fought Grim, and it made her feel like she was fighting Grim. That was something she didn't want when fighting people. Did she know that one day her hand could be forced? That one day she would have no choice? Yes. Of course she knew that. But until that day came, there wasn't a need for her to go all out against her friends. Running a hand through her hair, Ruby walked towards her dorm room. After they'd all finished their ice cream, she, Coco, and Yang had all gone to catch a movie. It wasn't anything she herself was interested in, since the entire thing revolved around bikes and cars, but it had been Yang's turn to choose. She had never quite understood her sister's fascination with vehicles, but then again, Yang had never been too fond of weapons either. After the film though, Yang and Coco had wandered off to have some alone time, and Ruby had decided to return home and clean out Crescent Rose. Maybe she would even think about what Yang had said, since she'd been honest about giving it some serious thought, even though she knew what her conclusion would likely be. However, as she opened the door, she was greeted by a sight that she definitely did not expect. The room that was normally so clean, so as to not risk Weiss blowing up at them, was a mess. Every cushion for the couch had been thrown across the floor, books littered the ground with paper and pens beside them, and a wide array of clothes, from red socks to yellow t-shirts, laid atop everything. The room looked like someone had ransacked it in search of something, and from the shuffling she could hear near the door to the bathroom, it was clear that the culprit was still in the room. So, pulling her side from her hip, she walked tentatively into the room, even though she had a sneaking suspicion of what had caused the destruction. Sure enough, the moment she was clear of the door, she looked to the side and saw a shining white Borbatusk. Its head was buried in one of Blake's drawers, and it didn't seem to notice her just yet. Though the heiress seemed to still be oblivious to it, the entire team had begun to notice small things about Weiss summons. Odd behaviors and the sort. Though the Beowulf was rather docile, and just enjoyed being around them, the others were a little different. The Borbatusk had been a recent attempt for Weiss in her attempts to train her aura, and its results had been disastrous. It had been fine at first, but the moment her focus had turned to her homework, the boar had immediately begun to tear apart the room. And despite it being her summon, Weiss had struggled to get it under control for a good minute. Even with their odd behavior, however, Weiss' summons were never a danger to others, so she lowered her weapon and looked around for its owner. It didn't take long to spot the heiress fast asleep in her bed. It wasn't too unusual for Weiss to take a small nap, especially after training, but it was the first time she'd seen her summon in her sleep. "Hey!" she whispered scoldingly to the shimmering boar. Her words caught its attention, and its head turned to face her, a pair of purple underwear on its tusk. "Stop that!" She was greeted by a loud snort from the beast, a puff of smoke emanating from its nostrils. Stepping forward, she tried to snatch the underwear from its tusk, but the pig stepped back and eyed her up cautiously. She knew that look. "Okay," she said, trying to gently approach it again with her arms up as it took yet another step back. "You stay still, and I'm just going to take TH. Damn it!" She lunged to the side in an attempt to catch the boar, but she was too late. Her fingers grazed the hard armor that covered its soft fur as it rolled past her, and she fell with a hard thud on the ground. Immediately getting to her feet, she activated her semblance and took off after it. Even with her speed though, the beast nimbly evaded her. She knew she could simply force it to fade by killing it, but some part of her felt it was wrong to do that outside of combat. After a couple of seconds, in which she had already face planted into the couch while the pig bounced off it like a ping-pong ball, she found herself yet again facing off with it at a distance. Watching it carefully for which way it would roll this time, Ruby lowered her center of gravity in preparation. As it looked at her though, Ruby noticed a glint of something in its eyes, and was almost convinced it was enjoying the game of cat and mouse, or boar and huntress. "Ruby?" said a tired voice behind her. "What's happening?" "Wait." Unfortunately, as she turned her head to look at the sleepy heiress, who was rubbing her eyes free of sleep, she realized her mistake. The sounds of rolling greeted her ears, and before she could even turn back, something heavy collided with her legs. Feeling them taken out from beneath her, she plummeted to the ground and let out a low groan. "Ruby!" Rolling to her side, she saw the piggy rise onto its hind legs and snort with victory before being turned to smoke with a flick of Weiss' wrist, Blake's underwear flopping to the ground where it had previously been. Even though it had destroyed the room and ran her around for at least a minute, she was a little sad to see it go. It just seemed like it wanted to have fun. "Are you okay?" Weiss asked, quickly sitting up in her bed. "I have no idea why it was summoned. That's never happened before." "It's fine," Ruby chuckled, standing up and brushing her legs with her hands. "I like running." She looked around the room, and her chuckle turned to a sigh. "Not a fan of cleaning, though." "I'm aware." The heiress yawned behind her hand. The moment her eyes seemed to take it the full state of the room, though, she shook her head and pinched the bridge of her nose. "This is my fault, though. I need to get them under control." Maybe it just wanted to have fun. Ruby poised, only for Weiss to shake her head again. I already told this to Yang. They are aura constructs, Ruby. They don't want anything. Okay, Ruby replied, though she didn't quite believe that herself. We should clean up before the others get back, though. Receiving a nod from her partner, she set about fixing the room. Thankfully, nothing had been broken. All of it was simply things that had been knocked over and tossed aside. Sure, there were a few dog-eared books, and some clothes with ink stains on them, but nothing that any of her team would care about, especially since nothing of Weiss was stained. However, even though she had picked up most of the clothes while Weiss attended to the books and paper, there had been one area she'd avoided, where she'd first seen the boar. Strewn across the ground among Yang's t-shirts and shorts were a mix of black and purple underwear. It wasn't that she thought they were dirty, they were just underwear after all, but it was definitely a little awkward to consider handling them. Most of the room was back to normal, so if Blake walked in, would she be able to pass it off as simply returning them to their place? Doubtful. She would likely babble something embarrassing as usual. But she could hardly leave them on the floor, or they definitely would get dirty. With that as her motivator, and the fact that she knew Blake would realistically be back from training for at least another hour or two, she let out a sigh and started to sift through the chaos. She'd only been at it for barely a minute before she heard a snort from behind her. Turning around, she saw her best friend watching her out the corner of her eye with a smirk on her face. What? She asked nervously. You're holding those like they're nibblers. I am not, Ruby countered. However, as she looked back, she found she was indeed holding the black lace by the tips of her fingers. Okay, Fian, but they're so much more delicate than mine. I don't want to rip them with my dumb mechanic hands. Considering everything else you destroy, it would not surprise me. Hey! I'm joking, Ruby. Weiss breathed and dropped a book onto her table. Though only a little. You're not going to rip them, so just put them away. Something else was muttered under the heiress' breath, but Ruby didn't hear and had a sneaking suspicion she didn't want to either. All right. Forgoing folding the thin material, Ruby began to pick up the assortment of bras and panties, and simply placed them in the correct drawer. When she was finally halfway through Yang's shirts, she felt her fingers collide with some kind of wrapper. It felt like plastic, so she pulled it free and felt herself blush. In her hand was the lingerie she had accidentally bought over Christmas, as well as the other one Blake had mentioned. Just as she had when Blake had opened the package, Ruby couldn't help but imagine her girlfriend in both of them. It was definitely something that caused a warmth to pool in her stomach, but she quickly ignored it and placed them back into the drawer too. Finally, when it was all cleaned up, she turned around to face her partner just in time to see her replace the final cushion on the couch. Despite her hesitance to keep it initially, she no longer seemed to have an issue dropping onto it and letting out a relieved sigh. Seeing the girl close her eyes, Ruby bounced over and sat down beside her. It took a couple of seconds, but the girl finally acknowledged her. What? How was training? Fine. But I'm tired, Ruby. Sorry, she mumbled, pulling her legs up and tucking them under herself. Digging around in her back pocket, she pulled out the gift she had made for the girl and nervously twisted it in her hand. I have something for you. A low groan escaped from Weiss, and one eye opened. This had better not be more cookies. You know my rule. Only on Saturdays, Ruby reiterated. But it's not cookies. Close your eyes. Another sigh escaped her, but she did as instructed. However, as Ruby reached out and took the girl's hand, she dearly hoped that her gift wouldn't be seen as childish. Nevertheless, she took a breath and slipped the band around Weiss' wrist, twisting the small snowflake to trigger the latch that was hidden underneath. With it on the girl's wrist, Ruby felt a smile pull at her lips as she inspected her work. It wasn't much, but she had tried to make the bracelet look as nice as she could. Thankfully, it fit perfectly, and the 1-inch width wasn't enough to make it look bulky. Though most of it was made of the same cloudy metal as her side's new blade, there were a few steel snowflakes that peppered the surface. Each one of them riveted into the metal with a small divot in their center. Happy with how it worked, she pulled her hand away. You can open them now, she said nervously. Weiss opened her eyes and raised the arm with the bracelet into the air. She was quiet as she inspected it, and unable to take the awkward silence, Ruby tried to explain it a little better. You're my best friend, so I thought it would be cool, she explained shyly, and she tapped the tips of her index fingers together. It's sort of a friendship bracelet, But you might think those are dumb, so I wanted it to be something useful too. Useful? Weiss asked, her tone unreadable. Why yeah. Ruby reached out and touched the cloudy metal. I used the last of my dust till to make it, and those snowflakes there can hold a dust gem. See the grooves? She pointed to the markings on the divots. It won't do much, but I figured that you could use it to enhance your glyphs. You know, if you get disarmed or something. Again Weiss remained silent, and Ruby's nerves started to turn a little towards worry. It wasn't like Weiss to hold back on her thoughts, and with her face still pretty unreadable, there was little Ruby could do but sit there and wait. Unfortunately, that wasn't something she was very good at, so barely a minute passed before she spoke again. Do you hate it? She asked. It seemed to snap Weiss out of her trance, and her eyes finally flicked away from the bracelet to her. Much to Ruby's surprise, the bright blue orb seemed to be swimming in tears. No, the girl stuttered, her eyes falling to the couch cushion. Sorry. Nobody has ever given me something like this before, she said in an equally low mumble. Oh! Ruby felt the knot in her stomach unwind, and a weight was lifted from her shoulders. As so you like it? It's perfect, Ruby, the girl breathed, her eyes raising from the couch to look at her, as if contemplating something. Ruby wouldn't have to wait long for what the thing was, however, since she was surprised yet again as Weiss pressed into her. Arms wrapped around her waist, and Weiss' head came to rest on her shoulder. Ruby didn't know how the girl's hair could possibly smell of snow, but she swore she did. She wasn't going to complain, though. A hug from Weiss was rare, and always short-lived, so she happily returned it with a smile. Thank you. The voice was quiet, but it was in the distinctive tone she'd come to recognize as Weiss being sincere. She knew it didn't need a reply, and sure enough though, just as usual, the hug ended pretty quickly. Ruby didn't mind though, since simply receiving one was more than pretty much anyone would ever get. When the girl pulled back though, Ruby reached back into her pouch again and pulled a small box free. I made a few for you already, she said, placing it between them and pulling the lid open to reveal a collection of neatly arranged gems the size of small mints. They'll only help with 1 or 2 glyphs each, but I can show you how to make more. Ruby watched Weiss pick up a piece of ice dust and twist it into place on the bracelet. It looked pretty normal for the first few seconds, but the heiress activated her aura, and a bright blue light shimmered around her body. At the same time, the gem glowed as Weiss focused her aura into it, turning the metal around it to a light blue. Flexing her hand, she produced a glyph in front of them and began to summon a small ball of ice. It was less than Ruby had expected, being roughly the same size as a beach ball, but Weiss seems happy with it nonetheless. This will work just fine, the snowy-haired girl said with a smile. Well, I'm just glad you like it. Ruby chuckled nervously, leaning back on the couch and letting out a breath of relief. Yes. Well, I am hardly so crass as to reject a gift from my best friend. Though Ruby had just laid down, she quickly sat up again. Especially when you made it for me. Did you just call me your best friend? And you will tell no one, the girl said sternly. I have a reputation to uphold. Knowing the girl was joking, even without the need to smirk on her lips, Ruby stuck her tongue and leaned back again. The day had been a good one. Spending time with her sister and getting Weiss to admit they were best friends would always be a good day. But as she let herself relax, yanked her interest wormed back into her head. Still unsure how she would actually make her sister happy, she decided to ask someone whose advice she valued. Hey, Weiss? The girl replied, her own eyes already closed again. Would you be alright if I went all out against you in sparring? Hypothetically, I mean. Yang finally talked to you then? Ruby let out a low grumble that was practically confirmation. Honestly, Ruby, I'm insulted that you don't already. Letting out a sigh, Ruby closed her eyes too, letting the silence envelop her. It was something that she was definitely going to need to think about, if only to make Yang happy, but she was determined to keep her promise to her sister. After all, Yang had kept every promise she'd ever made. Chapter 42, A Darker Time. June 3, 2013. Ilya stormed off again today. I tried to talk to her about the upcoming raid, but she wouldn't hear it. Maybe I shouldn't even be having these thoughts anyway. After all, what we are doing is helping people, right? I'm not too sure these days. Maybe we are going about it wrong. Maybe there is a better way. A way that doesn't involve bloodshed. But surely my dad would have found it already. But if there was such a way, he wouldn't have handed things over to Sienna. I don't know. I really need to stop thinking like this. I'm starting to feel like a traitor. I just need to focus on the raid. There are too many faunas trapped on that farm. June 5, 2013. I don't know how things went so wrong. The plan was perfect. Set the barn on fire, knock out the huntsman, get the faunas off the farm while Adam keeps the owners occupied. Things rarely go as planned, but they actually helped try to put the fire out. They helped. I thought they were just too conditioned, but they actually screamed at us. They called us monsters, told us we had no idea what we were doing. And then the Grimm came. We couldn't convince them to run, couldn't convince them they were free. I tried to get Adam so that he could talk some sense into them, but when I got in the kitchen, there was blood everywhere. The owner's wife was crying weeping over the body of her husband, and Adam was just standing there without remorse. He says the man drew a gun on him, that he only acted in self-defense, but I didn't see a gun anywhere. By the time we left the house, Grimm were everywhere. We barely made it out alive, and I have no idea what to think anymore. Why did they try to put out the fire? Why did Adam kill that man? None of this makes sense. Unless... No. I'm just tired. It's been a long day, and I need some rest. June 7th. June 12, 20. June 16, 2013. Looking back on that day is painful. Even trying to open this diary only to see what I wrote about it makes me flashback to it. But I met a man today. I was out on patrol, just walking the woods trying to clear my head when I spotted him. I recognized him immediately. He tried to put out the fires. He was the one who called us monsters. I know I shouldn't have approached. I should have just let him continue along the road to Cheyenne, but something made me reveal myself to him. He was scared at first, and I worried he might recognize me, but he didn't. When he asked who I was, I lied. Told him I was headed to Mistral to enroll at Haven. With a weapon on my back, it wasn't hard to convince him. I even offered to walk with him to the nearest crossroads. I don't know why, but while we walked, I asked him where he came from, and I wish I never had. He told me about the farm we raided, and how he came to work there. Apparently the owner of the farm and his son had saved them when a group of bandits raided their camp. He'd heard the commotion and come running to help, but had been too late to save the camp. Afterwards, he'd offered everyone a place on his farm, a chance to work and earn some money, so that they could eventually rebuild somewhere new. He'd never forced them, never asked too much, and always worked the farm himself too. Apparently, he was a good man who was always trying to help people. And we killed him. We ruined everything. When we got to the crossroad and went our separate ways, I tried to make my way back to the camp. But I couldn't. It was only an hour walk, but it took me 5 hours of thought, and I still have no idea what to make of everything. Adam said he was sure that they were slaves, that they were there against their will. But he was wrong. How many other things has he been wrong about? How many other times had people just been scared and gone with it? How many times have we been the monsters? I know what Adam would say. That mistakes happen, and that they were acceptable so long as we were helping give faunas their freedom. That humans had done far worse to us. But is he right? Are the mistakes acceptable? Does the past really justify our violence now? Or does knowing what said violence feels like, and then committing it unto others make us worse than them? Or have I just been Beli? Ruby? Ah! Dropping the book from surprise, Ruby tried her best to hide it from Blake. However, in her fumbling, she knocked it off the bed and onto the floor. Truthfully, she hadn't known what the book even was when she'd picked it up. Upon getting back to the dorm after class, she was in the mood for a little light reading. Unfortunately, when she picked up the manga she'd been saving, she remembered that she'd already read it the week before. Sadly, it was a forgettable chapter. So, with nothing else of her own left unread, she'd made her way over to Blake's side of the room. However, since Blake had so many books, Ruby had simply taken one at random and retired to her bed. It wasn't until opening it that she realized what it was. By the time she did though, it was already too late. Ruby knew that she really shouldn't have been reading Blake's diary, that it was definitely an invasion of the fauna's privacy, but the little she had already read had intrigued her. Since Blake was always so quiet about her past, even Ruby didn't know much of what had happened, so the fact that she had something in her hands that was giving her a little glimpse of the girl's life had been a little too tempting to put down. However, she was kind of regretting reading what she had. While the diary contained many really good drawings of things like Gamble's shroud, a red-hued blade, and a girl with freckles, Blake's past thoughts were not pleasant, to say the least. The diary had covered almost all of the previous year, but Ruby had skipped some of the darker parts. Raids, training, even her relationship with someone who was clearly very bad for Blake. Whenever the entries began to lighten, there would be one about Adam, and after every Adam entry, the next few entries would become dark again. It was disturbing reading about their relationship, and how he seemed to be warping her mind to fit his views, but there were still glimmers of light while reading. Ilya was one of them, and a name Ruby recognized. While the girl was definitely pretty extreme in her own methods, Blake always wrote about her seeming torn between right and wrong. There were more than a few entries about them just hanging out and relaxing, and Blake definitely seemed to be aware of the fact Ilya had a crush on her. The other bright side was that Blake's thoughts did lighten more and more as she read, but that anger was definitely still there. Ruby wasn't quite sure what the catalyst was that finally made her start questioning things was, since Blake hadn't written it down from what she could tell, but it was clear to see that she had begun to have her doubts around late April. However, Ruby also knew everything she had just read should have been told to her when Blake was ready. To have read it without her permission, to disregard her privacy like that was wrong, and she deserved whatever reprimanding that Blake was going to give. So, waiting silently with her head hung low, she watched from her top bunk as Blake leaned down and picked the book up from the floor. Holding it flat in her hand, the diary immediately fell open to June, where Ruby had smoothed out the gutter. "June!" Blake let out a sad sigh and ran a hand over the pages. "Shit, Mon. I'm sorry. I really shouldn't have been reading that, but I didn't know, and when I found out, I was too curious and I know I should stop." "Ruby. Reading, but you never talk about it, so it was interest." "Ruby!" The firm voice and the snap of the dairy closing cut off her ramblings, and she looked up to see Blake staring at her. "I'm not mad." "Why, you're not?" Blake turned the book in her hands, no longer looking at it, and shook her head. "Well, I prefer you just ask me. But I'm not exactly hiding them." Oh. That was true. It wasn't like the book was hidden behind her bed or anything. They'd simply been in the small bookcase that the team used. Even looking over in that moment, Ruby could see another black spine without a name that seemed like another of the diaries. However, if the one she was reading was from the year Blake left the White Fan, she wasn't sure she could handle one from a year before then. So, Blake tossed the book back onto her own bed and rubbed her left arm. "Do you have any questions? About what you just read?" Ruby tapped the tips of her fingers together and looked up at her girlfriend. "A few. But only if you don't mind answering them." Receiving a small nod from Blake, Ruby shifted aside on her bed to allow the girl to jump up. Pulling her knees up to her chest, she remained silent for a minute or two as she thought over her questions. Did she ask about Adam? Ilya? They both interested her since they seemed like important people to the story, but she was leaning more towards the change in her mentality. Out the corner of her eye, she saw Blake remove the ribbon from her ear and found herself momentarily distracted. They looked a lot fluffier lately, like Blake was letting the hair in them grow out a little. It was something Ruby quite liked, but she quickly pulled her eyes away and settled on her first question. "So, she gave a nervous chuckle. "I know this might be a little rude, but, why were you so angry? Enough to do those things, I mean." "It's not was, Ruby," Blake breathed as she leaned back against the wall. "It still is. A lot of fawness are angry, many just try not to draw attention to themselves. That anger you read in that diary, that's still a part of me." "Really? I never see it." "Because it's not when I'm around you. Or the others. You all make me forget those things for a while, and I'm just me. But when I see Cardin bullying me on, or the weird looks my fellow faunus get, or even the way Yatsu says something sometimes, I still get angry at those things. With Yatsu, I know he doesn't mean it, and I'm more angry that it's just how people are in Mistral, and they never give it a second thought. But with the others, with everything else, it just shows how little they think of us. They still think we're just animals, and when they treat us that way, it's still difficult to not just lash out. But you don't. That doesn't mean the desire isn't there." Blake sighed. "Hell, when our first semester started, I attacked 2 students because they were harassing Velvet. Yon does that all the time, though." "Not like this," Blake said with a shake of her head. "Yon fights because it's fun, and she knows others here are always willing to fight her. I wanted to hurt them so that they knew what it was like to feel what we feel every day. I wouldn't do that now, but that was a long battle for me, and I'm worried it won't take much for me to slip back into that." Ruby reached out and took the girl's hand. I won't let you. You're a good person, Blake. If I was a good person, I wouldn't have to try so hard to be one. Or trying to be one makes you a better person. Ruby didn't know what she'd said, but she heard Blake let out a dry chuckle, and the finger slipped through her own. It had been a line she'd read from one of Weiss' philosophy books when she was bored, and was to have finally found a way to use it, though she was pretty sure she had messed it up pretty badly. But Blake didn't seem to mind. Instead, Ruby felt herself pulled into a sidelong hug, and an arm snaked around her shoulders. For a couple minutes, she simply sat there in silence, mulling over Blake's answer. She hadn't known that Blake was still struggling with those feelings, nor that they were so strong. Sure, she saw the dirty looks she gave Cardin, and how dismissive she was of the boy, but not that she was tempted to hurt him. Though from what Flint said, while they were working at the forge, Weiss was the one doing the attacking for the most part. Though she would normally reprimand her partner for such an action, she had never bothered to bring it up since Cardin was starting to get on her nerves too with how he acted. Though she still knew there were good parts to him too, like being a huntsman and how he treated his friends. She'd once overheard him consoling Sky after the boy was dumped by a girl. Any other questions? She turned her head slightly and saw Blake looking at her out of the corner of her eye. There was definitely one question she wanted to ask, mostly out of curiosity because they were dating, but she didn't feel it was her place. I probably shouldn't. She looked away a little, but the hum of understanding from Blake showed the girl had pretty much read her mind. Adam? Ruby hesitated for a little bit, but gave a small nod. He sounded awful. He ended up that way, yeah? Ended up? He wasn't always. Blake sighed, with a noncommittal shrug. Just another boy who got lost, strayed too far into the shadows, and let his soul get consumed by hate. But what he became, the things he did, he became worse than the people he hated. There was a sadness to Blake's voice. Remembering past conversations, Ruby knew that Blake definitely no longer cared for Adam, so could only assume the sadness came from the fact Adam turned that way in the first place. Sensing it was a hard topic for the girl though, and not really wanting to hear about all the awful stuff Adam had done or made Blake do, she decided to try for a different topic. What about Ilya? Is she like him or? No. Blake's reply was quick, and there was a certainty to her voice. Ilya is a little aggressive, but she isn't a bad person. She's like I was, believing what she is doing is for the best. I just hope that she finds her way out like I did. She sounds complicated. She was. And you two never? Blake glanced down at her with a raised eyebrow. I mean, kinda seemed like you knew she was into you or something? Blake hummed with a nod. Yeah. No, wait. I mean, I know she liked me. But nothing happened there. Gotcha. Finding herself with no more questions, Ruby simply gave a small nod and nestled into her girlfriend. Though she still felt bad for reading the diary, it was at least good to know that Blake was willing to be honest with her about everything inside, and was very happy that the girl hadn't been angry. However, as she sat that, she could tell something was a little off Blake still, so looked up at her curiously. Do you feel differently about me after reading that? Ruby felt the fingers on the back of her hand nervously stroke back and forth. I'd understand if it made you think of me differently. It's not exactly light reading. Nope, she replied with a smile. The things she'd read definitely were a little rough, but they in no way changed how she felt about Blake. You're still the best girlfriend ever. Lifting her head up, she pressed her lips against Blake's. A small breath of relief brushed across her face before the girl's lips pulled into a smile. She liked feeling that little action beneath her own, how it was just one of the little reassurances that Blake really did enjoy being kissed. That she liked the affection in general. It didn't last long though, since she pulled away and happily gazed up at her. I already knew you had a rough past anyway. She shrugged. Thankfully, it slightly widened the smile on Blake's face. So you want to watch a movie or something? I know you're always tired after sparring with Xanthia. Sure, Blake replied, her tone a little lighter than before. You can choose. All right. Ruby grinned, hopping down off her bed. Unfortunately, she hadn't put the Holliviewer onto a rotating platform yet, so they would have to make do with the couch. That didn't seem to be a problem for Blake though, since she too jumped down from the bed and dragged a quilt with her. Very aware that she was smiling stupidly to herself, she grabbed her scroll under her pillow and jumped over to the couch, settling in for a movie night with her girlfriend. Laid on the couch in Blake's arms, Ruby felt awash in happiness. Though the afternoon had started off a little weird with the diaries, talking about it had cleared a lot of the air, and the show cleared the rest. Since Blake had allowed her to choose, Ruby had immediately scrolled through Remflix to the documentary section and put on one about a strange man who would show up in a town and make everyone laugh for a week before moving on. It was one of Ruby's favorites. Not only because it showed what huntsmen and huntresses should be doing, going around helping people, but it was also absurdly stupid. Though many suspected that the man was using a semblance, nobody was actually sure what it was. Not only did he make everyone laugh, but he would also produce random items from nowhere and light everything up with a green light. It also helped that a lot of the people who were giving testimonies were really quite old, since the event the documentary was exploring had happened nearly 90 years ago, so their accounts were often hilariously strange. "So what does Yang think his semblance was?" Blake chuckled as one of the people talked about a time he made a building dance. "She thinks he's slipped everyone drugs." "Typical Yang." The faunus chuckled. "I'm still holding on to him being able to create illusions that people think are real." Could be." Ruby hummed thoughtfully. "I still think he was like Ren and Neon. Or maybe he was a descendant of that man who lived on Patch all that time ago." Blake chuckled sarcastically. "Mr. Magic Man with green light. But he had a staff, this guy has a cane." Ruby hummed thoughtfully. It was fun to talk about it with Blake, as the documentary was one Ruby was still trying to figure out, since even its own ending was rather speculatory. She couldn't count how many times she had talked it over with Yang, who would come up with increasingly stupid explanation as to how the man did what he did. "Or maybe he was Othman," Blake said with a mischievous tone. "He likes green and has a cane. He isn't that old." Ruby laughed, turned her head to look at her girlfriend. "He's pretty damn old." "Is not. He needs a cane. It's his weapon." Likely excuse. Laughing at the faunus' stupid answer that rivaled even Yang, Ruby twisted in place beneath the quilt and looked her girlfriend in the eyes. It was good to see them happy again after everything with the diary. It was so good in fact that Ruby couldn't help but press her lips to the girls. It was also a very good way of getting her to shut up. Thankfully, the ploy worked and Ruby felt Blake's arms tighten around her waist. Feeling a smile pull at her lips, she pulled away and gazed into the deep pools over Amber. The break only lasted a moment, however, as she was compelled to reclaim the lips, deepening the kiss and allowing herself to melt into the warmth that was Blake's body. A rush traveled through her, and the all-too-familiar knot began to settle in her stomach again. It wasn't uncomfortable though, and neither was it scary anymore. With how often these moments seemed to happen now, Ruby was used to it, and actually quite liked it. It filled her with anticipation and desire that caused her tongue to gently rub along Blake's lips to request access. The access was quickly granted, and Ruby let out a small hum of appreciation as the faunus' wet muscle came out to meet hers. Using her tongue had been a little awkward at first, since she was scared of screwing it up, but that too had become more comfortable as the pair practiced more. From what she could tell, Blake no longer seemed to find fault in her technique either, and that also spurred her to be a little more bold during their makeout sessions. She could tell that was something Blake liked too, for as much as the girl seemed to like taking charge of the kissing, Ruby couldn't help but notice that Blake also seemed to really like it when she took the initiative. With that in mind, Ruby began to shift herself slightly again. Using her arm, she pushed the material covering them both aside and slid her leg over Blake's. Using her now free arms, she pushed herself up, careful not to break the kiss, and moved to straddle the girl's waist. It was a position that had become very familiar over the week, and as such, Blake's hand immediately took their place on her hips, holding her gently in place. A small hum of satisfaction escaped the raven-haired beauty, and Ruby smiled at how much of an effect that simple action had on her. For what felt like minutes, they both enjoyed the affection. It was rare to have the room to themselves for so long, but Weiss was off helping a student with dust, and Yang randomly declared that she was headed to Patch for something. Since the blonde would likely ride Bumblebee back, Ruby was confident they both had a decent amount of time before they were interrupted. Because of that, she allowed herself to enjoy the moment for what it was without worry. That wasn't to say there wasn't a little hesitation when she felt Blake's hand slowly begin to travel down from her hips. It wasn't bad though. In fact, it only helped to build the anticipation within her. Inch by inch, the hand slowly worked its way downwards, leaving Ruby plenty of time to stop it. She didn't though, she knew where it was going, and she didn't mind at all. Finally, though, she let out a small gasp and broke the kiss as Blake's hand slipped onto her, and simply rested there, the strong fingers applying just enough pressure for Ruby to feel her breath catch at the new sensation. Thankfully, Ruby knew she had what many would consider to be a good butt from all her running, and Blake definitely seemed to find it satisfactory from the smile that pulled at her lips. Taking that as a good sign, Ruby grinned down at her too, as Blake reached up to reclaim her lips. Blake's lips crashed into her with much more gusto than before, and Ruby was reminded of that time back in the forest amid the ruins when Blake had partially lost control of herself. The wild way that Blake's fingers grabbed at her, and the heavy breathing fogged her mind, and she found herself wanting it more herself too. As if on its own, her hand began to slowly slide up the faunus front, the soft fabric sliding beneath her fingertips. It wasn't until they met a very distinct curve that she realized exactly what they were doing, but she was so caught up in the moment and didn't have the presence of mind to stop herself. And probably more importantly, she didn't want to. Blake wasn't just a person she loved hanging out with or talking to. She was also someone whose body Ruby's mind would constantly wander to. The girl was gorgeous, and Ruby knew she had full permission to do whatever she wanted. So finally, with a small breath, she pushed past that particular boundary and let her hand find its goal. Though it was still covered in clothing, the soft mound of flesh that her hand found felt wonderful. The moment her hand cupped it, Blake took in a sharp breath of air, and Ruby felt the fingers on her butt dig in. The feeling sent sparks up her spine. Of course she felt her own breasts, but Blake's felt better in every way. They were just a little bigger, but felt so much softer and warmer. Acting on her own again, Ruby felt her finger twitch, and Blake let out yet another gasp as her teeth closed on Ruby's lips. The reaction alone was enough to encourage Ruby a little more. Opening her eyes, she saw Blake's were closed, and waiting for her to do it again. Figuring it was a day for big steps, and not wanting to stop, Ruby gently pulled her lips free to reclaim Blake's in. Sup, Ru-O-M. Ah. Yawn. Why gods. Feeling her entire body turn as red as her cape, Ruby pushed herself away from Blake so hard that she landed on her feet next to the couch. Snatched the discarded quilt midair, she wrapped it around her entire body despite being fully clothed still, leaving only one eye visible. A huge grin was plastered across Yang's face, and the blonde leaned against the door with her arms folded. What did I interrupt, huh? She cackled evilly. Or at least it sounded evil to her in that moment. Saw. And in nothing. She stuttered heavily. Can't you at least knock? Blake sighed as she sat up, clearly a little annoyed at the interruption herself. You know, like we do when Coco and Velvet are here. I didn't know you would be here feeling my little sister up. Yang replied with barely contained humor. Her poor, innocent little mind. You're CORR. The humor finally broke as Ruby picked up a cushion and hurled it at her sister. She didn't even try to dodge, and it struck her square in the face. Not that it helped at all, because the girl simply stood there laughing at them both. Unfortunately, it seemed Ruby's embarrassment was not over for the day, as another voice called from behind Yang and a man with black, slick back hair appeared in the doorway. He wore his usual gray tailcoat and black pants with a short cape hanging from his back. What's taking so long? Crow asked the brawler. Though we were all getting din. Yang cut him off by not so subtly pointing into the room. Taking the hint, Crow turned his head, and his pale red eyes widened a little. Oh, now this brings back memories. Oh my gods! Ruby breathed, feeling herself blush a deeper red and turning around. Normally she would be super excited to see the man, but the embarrassment of getting caught feeling up Blake dampened her usual reaction a little. You two are the worst. Hey, nothing to be ashamed of, kiddo. Crow chuckled, leaning against the door frame next to his niece. I definitely saw worse with your dad. Ew. The grin faded from Yang as she gave him a sidelong look. Gross, Crow. You think he was bad? Don't ever ask him what summit. He was cut off again as Ruby threw another pillow at her uncle. Ugh. She groaned at the pair and threw another cushion. Get it. Yang. Blake's head fell into her hands. Can't you just give us a minute? All right. The blonde laughed and pushed herself off the door. Let's go, Crow. Ruby, dinner in 20 minutes. Just us three. Fine. Just go. All right, I'm going. Yang grinned as she and Crow walked towards the door. Before she shut it, though, she stuck her head back through and stuck out her tongue. Calm your tits. Ugh. Yet another cushion was thrown, but the door was already closed, leaving behind nothing but the muffled laughter that floated in through the hallway. Shaking her head, Ruby let out a groan of frustration. "I hate sharing a room," she huffed, letting the quill drop. She had no idea why she had felt the need to cover herself in the first place, but that feeling had vanished when Yang left. "No you don't." Blake smiled, her hand coming out and entwining their fingers together. "You love sharing a room with her." Ruby let her lips form into a pout as she was pulled forward. Straddling Blake's lap again, she looked down at her girlfriend with a scowl. She knew the girl was trying to talk her around, but it wasn't going to work. Sharing a room with Yang meant they were always being interrupted and teased. It was constant embarrassment. "No I don't." "MHM. If you say so." Blake's strong hand moved up to her face, pushing back into her hair. Despite knowing she was trying to distract her, the simple action felt nice, and Ruby closed her eyes to enjoy it and leaned into the leading touch. Very gently, her head was lowered and lips pressed against her own. It wasn't the heated kiss from earlier, but the remnants of that session were still pulsing through her veins. Due to that, Ruby felt herself lean into it a little more than Blake probably intended. "I take it you enjoyed what just happened?" Blake asked curiously after breaking the kiss. Biting her bottom lip, Ruby opened her eyes to see her beautiful girlfriend was smiling mischievously. After a couple of seconds, she gave a small nod. "A lot," she said, feeling her face burn red again. "Did you?" Hands moved to her hips and slowly roamed downwards, just like they had earlier. Yet again, Ruby didn't stop them and felt her stomach flip when they found their goal. A glint entered Blake's eyes, and she could pull hers away from them. "Definitely," the fetching faunus replied. "But we probably shouldn't repeat it right now. And you should get ready for your dinner thing." "Nope." Ruby grinned, still not pulling away. "So? You gotta get up?" Pressing her lips against her girlfriend's, Ruby let out a low hum of contentment. While she wanted to stay, wanted to resume what had been started earlier, she knew she couldn't. The longer she delayed, the more Yang would tease, and since Crow was here, the more he would tease too. However, though she knew she should be moving, she allowed herself to revel in the feeling of Blake surrounding her for just a minute longer. Finally, though, she pulled away, gazing down with a smile at the beautiful girl beneath her. "You're tempting me on purpose." "Guilty as charged." Rolling her eyes and shaking her head, Ruby pushed herself off of Blake and stood up, straightening out her clothes. The groan of disappointment that issues from her team member was almost enough to make her go back, since she too felt the same, but she knew she had to get ready. "You know we won't get the room to ourselves again for a while, right?" Hearing the seductive tone in her girlfriend's voice, Ruby felt her stomach twist. "Well," Ruby said in her best attempt to be aloof, "I'm the one who sorts out the training schedule. Maybe Weiss and Jan will be busy soon." "Oh, is that a promise?" Instead of replying, she simply stuck out her tongue and made her way towards the bathroom. With one last look back at her, she pushed the door open and slipped inside. In truth, Blake's words had resonated with her. It would be a while before they next had the room to themselves. Which was a shame, because Ruby really had enjoyed how the relationship had just taken another step, as well as what that step was. And the fact that it could be a while before they could explore the new step a little more left her feeling a little disappointed. But there was little she could really do about that. It was the curse of sharing a room with two other people. All she could do was hope that Yang and Weiss found themselves busy over the next week or so. Not that she knew what would happen if she and Blake were alone together for longer. Would she have stopped where they had? Or would something else have happened? She wasn't sure. But she was definitely interested in finding out. "I suppose I can talk to Velvet or Coco," she thought to herself as she walked towards the sink. Though they likely couldn't help with Weiss, those two would definitely be able to get Yang away for a while. Yeah, she turned the tap on and splashed some water on her face. I should definitely talk to them.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.